midst of a global shift. We are transitioning from a unipolar world controlled by U.S. hegemony and imperialism to a multipolar world that is supported by countries in the global south, China, Russia, Iran, and other countries. If we, particularly as a people, continue to allow ourselves to be distracted by what Margaret Kimberly from Black Agenda Report calls the Trump derangement syndrome, and so many of these other distractions, if we aren't careful, we will once again become the cannon fodder for Americanism. And we will be like the prisoners in Plato's allegory of the cave. Socrates described a group of people, prisoners, who were lived chained to a wall all of their lives, facing a blank wall. And they watched shadows projected on the wall from objects passing in front of this fire that was behind them. And they gave names to these shadows, and the shadows became the prisoner's reality, but weren't accurate representations of what was going on in the real world. So we have to stop watching these shadows and start paying attention to what's really going on. And so for insight into this, let's turn to my next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
Your thoughts on my intro is Plato's allegory of the cave an accurate description of where we as either Africans in America or African Americans find ourselves today?
Well, the point that came to my mind as you began to talk about the decline of unipolarity, that is, say, a United States dominated planet, and the rise of multipolarity, with a critical role played by the People's Republic of China, Russia, amongst others. What I thought about was another grand transition, which helps to explain why there are so many Africans in North America speaking English. Mm-hmm. That is to say, recall in my book on the 16th century, The Dawning of the Apocalypse, I talk about how this minor monarchy on the fringes of Western Europe, speaking of what is now called Great Britain, how in the 16th century, it began to rise, not least because it had been attracted to the Protestant faith as devised by Martin Luther in 1517 in Germany against the hegemony of the Vatican, the Catholics, as represented by the Portuguese and the Spanish. The Spanish, of course, had sponsored Christopher Columbus. But what happens is that the Protestants, particularly in London, they cut a deal with what amounts to the Catholics' major foe, speaking of Ottoman Turkey, a predominantly Muslim country. And what happens is that deal, in a sense, backfires on the Ottoman Turks because it propels London forward to the point where London surges into the control of the African slave trade, which helps to explain why there are so many Africans in North America today speaking English. And so if you look at the rise of China, for example, ruled by a communist party, 50 years ago, Henry Kissinger cut a deal with so-called communist China against the interests of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. But once again, what happens is that Washington, like the Ottoman Turks, miscalculated, because now it seems that China's in the passing lane. It's the juggernaut. It has a population 4 times the size of the United States of America. It has a military that's growing by leaps and bounds. Rather shortly, the United States will not even be able to challenge China militarily. And in fact, as we speak, there are military maneuvers taking place between China and their Russian comrades. And so what's happening is that as that shift begins to take place, if you look at so-called secondary powers, you begin to see that they're shifting too. Look at Turkey, or Turkey, as it likes to be called nowadays. Just a few days ago, there was a 4-hour one-on-one meeting between President Erdogan of Turkey and President Putin of Russia. Now, keep in mind that Turkey is a member of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is prosecuting this conflict in support of Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia. Turkey also is a so-called candidate member of the European Union, although it has been on the threshold of joining the European Union since 1999, which probably suggests that they won't be joining anytime soon. And so I think what's about to happen is that Turkey is aware of what I just articulated, or Turkey, excuse me, and it's about to shift and establish firmer relations with the Moscow-led Eurasian Economic Union, which is Russia plus the old republics of the Soviet Union, all yoked to the Chinese economy, which shortly, if not already, will be the #1 economy. So the question, to go to the second part of your equation, is with all of these shifts taking place, whether the Black community, do our Black leaders, organizations, and intellectuals, are they aware of what's going on? Are they assuming that what is the status quo will be eternal? In which case you don't have to study, you don't have to learn, because if the status quo is eternal, you already know everything you need to know. But I dare say that those who've taken such a mistaken position in the past have minimally had their fingers burned.
Quickly, because you mentioned Henry Kissinger, and I've talked about him before over the last couple of weeks. I may have even discussed him with you, but I think it's important to reiterate. Kissinger, 99, is he 99 now?
Yes.
And when the oldest living alleged war criminal in the world, who was one of the masterminds of American foreign policy, says that the U.S. is on the edge of war with Russia and China, and says that the current administration is being misled, and says that they need more Nixonian type approaches to diplomacy. When Henry Kissinger is to the left of Joe Biden, how dangerous is that?
Well, what you're outlining is a real conundrum, which is how and why it seems that the Democrats, who are perceived to be to the left of conservatives on domestic policy.
Wait a minute, and he's to the left of the Congressional Black Caucus.
How the Democrats somehow wind up not to the left of many Republicans like Henry Kissinger when it comes to foreign policy. And I think it's explicable. I think part of it has to do with the Democratic Party base, speaking of the Black community, of being missing in action with regard to foreign policy, a direct result of the devil's bargain that was cut some decades ago when our leaders and intellectuals who were interested in the world, such as W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, were tossed overboard unceremoniously by the centrists and liberals led by the NAACP, who then were able to preside over these anti-Jim Crow concessions. The problem is that might have been a short-term gain, but it was a long-term loss given what we're talking about today. And then the other point that I would mention, of course, is the labor movement, which went through a similar process at the same time that Robeson and Du Bois were tossed overboard. And in fact, you had labor leaders of a similar stripe and conviction treated similarly. And so the AFL-CIO in particular has had an international department which has cooperated with the Central Intelligence Agency. In fact, I talk about in my book on Southern Africa, how during the darkest days of apartheid, sometimes AFL-CIO leaders thought that the CIA was acting like wimps. They wanted them to man up, for example. And then the other point is that I think that the Democrats, who have a multiracial base, somehow in the leadership, they feel insecure in this white supremacist nation. That is to say, that they fear a backlash, for example, from the 75 million strong base that voted for Trump, if they do not necessarily flex their muscles overseas. And so then they go overboard doing so, overcompensating, as a psychologist might say, leading to one debacle, one fiasco, one catastrophe after another.
Well, and I have said on a number of occasions that one of the major problems with the Democratic Party is they are constantly in pursuit of some of the same voters that the Republicans are, and in many instances have, middle-class white males. And so they don't want to appear to be too black because they don't want to alienate those middle-class white males and suburban female and suburban women, white suburban women.
And of course, having a view of the origins of this country, which is not overly romanticized, which is not indulge in creation myths, helps one to understand what you just articulated, because given the fact that the nation was founded upon solemn principles of white supremacy, as opposed to this fantasy that it was somehow founded on democratic principles, at the same time that Africans were doomed to be enslaved, were indigenous, were doomed to be subjected to genocide. But if you understand the true origins of the United States of America, you'll understand that that constituency that the Democrats are chasing after, they perceive that constituency as comprising the real foundation of the country. They really don't accept, just like many in the Trump base really don't accept many of us melanin rich individuals as being legitimate citizens, legitimate US nationals.
How about human?
Or even legitimate humans. And so that leads to this merry chase, or not so merry chase, for that voter that oftentimes, frequently indeed, are not willing to be snared.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Gerald Horne is my guest. And Gerald, Consortium News has a piece entitled Pan-Africa Response to the New Imperialism. It's by P. Anyang Nwango, a Kenyan politician and author who's also the current governor of Kisumu country. He writes, a new imperialism stalks the third world. It shares with the old an unquenchable thirst for its labor, its land, its minerals, and its water. If colonization depended on the political strategies of divide and rule, the imperialists no longer have to rule today. Instead, they rely on local elites eager to aid their people's exploitation in return for a share of the spoils, a process sanitized with the language of investments, trade deals, and partnerships. That might also apply to African-American leadership. But your thoughts about Nyango's take on a new imperialism stalking the third world?
Inevitably, it seems to me he was inspired by the recent trip to the continent by U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who dropped into South Africa, Rwanda, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. His line was that the United States will not dictate to African nations who their friends should be. This is the context of a recent visit to the continent by his counterpart, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. It's in the context of a lot of hysteria about the role of China in Africa, which is an extension of what I mentioned a moment or two ago. That is to say, hysteria concerning the rise of China, the impending eclipse of these European and Euro derivative countries such as the United States of America, who have, of course, lived large on the bankrupt principles of white supremacy for centuries. And now it seems with the rise of multipolarity, that's coming to an end. So you saw that Mr. Blinken tried to get in accord with the tides of history. But what's striking is that just before his arrival, the United States ambassador to the United Nations, speaking of the Black woman, Linda Thomas Greenfield, had toured African nations with a different tune, a different message. Her message was not necessarily aligned with that of Mr. Blinken. That is to say, she was raising alarms, sounding the alarms about China, about Russia, etc. Where Mr. Blinken, officially, he was rather laissez-faire about that matter. Now, I'm not sure if the right hand doesn't know what the ultra right hand is doing. I'm not so sure if the United States is acting like the slick lawyer who goes before the court and pleads inconsistent counts before the judge. In other words, telling the judge, Your Honor, my client didn't do it and he won't do it again, which supposedly will leave the court and the jury baffled. But whatever the case, this was a real head scratcher. But what is not a head scratcher, what is clear as the nose on your face, is multipolarity has arrived in Africa. I'm not only talking about the role of China in building railroads from Addis Ababa to Djibouti, or from Nairobi to Mombasa, or building a new parliamentary center in Zimbabwe, a new parliamentary capital in Egypt, which will relieve congestion in that overcrowded city, speaking of Cairo. So this has already arrived, and it's not a moment too soon, because as we look demographically, we see that people of African descent are roughly 12% of the world's population, but within a few decades, people of African descent will be 25% of the world's population, which will have enormous consequence politically. Already, during his trip to Uganda, you saw Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, having a sit down with President Museveni about expanding the United Nations Security Council, which reflects the correlation of forces in 1945, overly Eurocentric, and also is the major force and major source of international law, without any representatives from Africa, from Latin America, the only Asian representative being China, with US and Russia and Britain and France being the other permanent members in addition to China. That cannot stand with regard to the world of the future. Africans are discussing it. My question is, where do African Americans fit into this discussion? Of course, if you ask them in the abstract, they would probably say, well, we're going to stand with Africa. But given all of the China bashing that I hear in the Black community, which is bored with what the State Department, at least Linda Thomas Greenfield, says, I'm not so sure you should be certain about that proposition.
And I'm glad you brought up Blinken's trip, because he held a press conference with the South African Minister of International Relations, Naledi Pandor, and she accused, with Blinken sitting right there, and folks, you can go and look at the video. She accuses the West of sometimes taking a patronizing and bullying attitude towards Africa, and she made it clear that South Africa has different views from the U.S. on Ukraine, China, and Israel and the Palestinians. And I'm really glad she brought up Israel and the Palestinians, because I've been spending a lot of time trying to explain to our community why we need to pay attention to what's going on in Palestine. And she said, quote, Just as much as the people of Ukraine deserve their territory and freedom, the people of Palestine deserve their territory and freedom. And we should be equally concerned at what is happening to the people of Palestine as we are with what is happening to the people of Ukraine. We've not seen an even-handed approach. Now, for her to look at Tony Blinken and say that on the world stage, to me speaks volumes about how the unipolar world is shifting to a multipolar world. And to your point about Blinken going to these African countries and saying, hey, I'm here as your friend, and you guys need to be independent, and you guys need to do what's in your interest. And then we've got Gregory Meeks, the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, gloating about passing the Countering Malign Russian Activities Act in Africa, which is basically the United States sanctioning African countries because they won't buy into this failed, proven failed American sanctions regime. Your thoughts, sir?
Well, that latter point is really disappointing. Not necessarily disappointing with regard to Congressman Meeks. I expect no less, no more from him. But I'm speaking of the place where I used to live, speaking in New York City. People in New York City, as you know, they like to boast about the alleged sophistication of the Big Apple, but yet the congressman from Southeast Queens, a predominantly Black neighborhood that is quite boastful of the radicalism and progressivism that has emerged from that neighborhood, has not been able to rein in a man who is seeking to circumscribe the sovereignty of African nations, which is wholly and totally at odds with the direction in which Africa is going. Because whether Mr. Meeks knows or realizes it or not, the fact is that Africa has not only tried to cultivate positive, sound relations with Russia and China, even to return to Turkey or Turkey, a predominantly Muslim country, which between about 400 or 500 years leading up to the end of World War I in 1918, 1919, was actually presiding over a number of predominantly Muslim countries in the world, and not least in Africa, has come back with a vengeance in the 21st century. If you look at Somalia, where the United States bombs on a regular basis, I just heard a news report today saying that about a dozen Africans, unlikely young men, killed, delivered to their creator as a result of bombs dropped by the United States. And of course, the new leader of AFRICOM, the Africa Command, who is a Marine, a Black American Marine by the name of Langley. I don't think he's named after the CIA headquarters, but he might have wanted to prove his mettle by changing his surname. I'll leave it to your crack news team to figure that one out. But Turkey plays a major role in Somalia. It picks up the garbage. It's the power behind the throne. It runs the airport. It runs the ports. And I wonder if this apparent conflict between the United States and Turkey and Somalia might have something to do with President Erdogan of Turkey cozying up to President Putin, which is what I mentioned a moment or two ago. Now, these are the kinds of suppositions and informed speculation that we need to be engaged in as we try to figure out where this small planet is heading. But I'm afraid to say that that kind of discourse is sadly and conspicuously missing, up to and including the point of ignoring the real vampire in Africa, speaking of France, which just got kicked out of Mali because of its inability to do what it said it was going to do, which was stop an insurgency of religious zealots, and is the major bloodsucker on the African continent, France's ability to portray itself as a world power basically turns upon exploitation of Africa. Speaking of which, and here's a message to our scholars, we really need someone to do a good deed on behalf of Madagascar, that island nation off the southeast coast of Africa. Because in 1947, in one of the most severe and bloody massacres in the history of the world, French colonialists massacred tens of thousands of Africans in Madagascar in a massacre that's hardly known in this country, despite the fact that over the decades, you've had a number of migrants from Madagascar who played a major role in our culture. Speaking of Black American culture, I'm speaking of Andy Razaf, R-A-Z-A-F, of Madagascar descent, a composer, songwriter from decades ago. Ain't Misbehaving, I think, was one of his tunes, if not other tunes that were listened to quite frequently by our grandparents and our great-grandparents. And so there's so much work that we need to do, because given the direction this country is heading, it's unclear what our fate will be with regard to this new world order, with regard to this multipolarity that you just made reference to. And we need to start building these bridges to places like Madagascar, to the family of Andy Razaf, who also, in addition to Ain't Misbehaving, composed the Honeysuckle Rose. And so there's a lot of work to be done, and there's no time like the present to commence.
And on this point, and then we'll get out for the moment, in terms of Blinken's message, over the last 24 months, there have been, 7 coup attempts in African nations. There, Burkina Faso, Chad, Guinea, Mali, and Sudan. In Niger and Guinea-Bissau, those failed, but most of those were backed by AFRICOM, or the groups that were engaged in the coups were trained by AFRICOM. And in some of those instances, the leaders of the coups met with American officials the day before the coup took place. So nobody's being fooled anymore. My point in bringing this up is nobody is being fooled anymore by this American rhetoric, because this unipolar game is over. A minute before we got to get out.
Well, you are certainly correct. And sadly and tragically, there's nothing new about U.S. sponsorships of coups and of malignant governments. Mr. Blinken should have been made to apologize when he landed in Pretoria, South Africa. I take it that the South African authorities were too diplomatic and too polite to force him to do so. He certainly should apologize when he landed in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, since we know that their kleptocratic leader, once known as Joseph Mobutu, collaborated with the CIA in terms of the execution of founding father Patrice Lumumba circa 1961. And Mr. Blinken should have been made not only to apologize, but to offer up reparations for all the damage done to the Democratic Republic of Congo, which, by the way, during the bad old days of slavery, was a happy hunting ground for enslavers. Indeed, I suspect that of your Black audience, probably 35% or more are of Congolese descent without realizing.
And talking about this transition from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. And one of the things that I found very interesting, and folks, you should take some time and read some of this Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov's statements and answers to the questions during a meeting with permanent representatives of the member countries of the African Union They were in Addis Ababa on the 27th of July. And he says, what we witness now, especially as the West launches an unprecedented campaign of sanctions, accusations, threats vis-a-vis Russia and anybody who dares to support Russia or even not to condemn Russia. This campaign indicates that we are living through a very important historical period, a period where we will all be deciding what kind of universe we are going to have and to leave for our children and grandchildren. The universe, which is based on the United Nations Charter, which says that the United Nations is founded on the principle of sovereign equality of states, or we will have the world where the right of force, the right of the strongest dominates. Your thoughts on this really intense move by Russia as well as China, but in this particular part of the discussion, Russia, to expand its influence in or with African countries, and it's hard to argue with what Lavrov said.
Well, Russia has an advantage over the North Atlantic countries when it comes to Africa. It's not only because of the predecessor state, speaking of the Soviet Union, armed liberation fighters in Angola, in Namibia, in South Africa, in Mozambique, etc. But also because Russia does not have the same sordid history with regard to the African slave trade. In fact, if you begin to dig a little deeper, you'll find that during the bad old days of slavery, when the North Atlantic countries were enslaving Africans and the Ottoman Turks were equal opportunity enslavers, they enslaved Africans. They also enslaved quite a number of Russians, by the way. And that gives Russia a certain kind of parallel history or parallel understanding, I should say, with regard to many African nations. And then, of course, Western European nations cannot boast of a figure like Pushkin of African descent, considered to be not only a father of the modern Russian language, but a father of Russian literature.
Right.
Many intelligent Russians can recite his poetry at the drop of a hat. And that's because as the Western Europeans were moving south to Africa and west across the Atlantic, Russia was moving east across Asia. And so what that means, if you look at your map, is that Russia has more territory. It's the largest European country by far. It has the largest population in Europe by far, almost twice as large as the number 2 nation, speaking of the Federal Republic of Germany, which has a population of about 80 million. And so that's always been this contradiction in European history, whereby the Western Europeans purported to rule the planet, but did not necessarily rule their own backyard, which led to Napoleon trying to reverse the tides of history by invading Russia and being soundly defeated about 200 years ago. It leads to Britain helping to sponsor the Japanese attack on Russia circa 1904, 1905, which backfires spectacularly insofar as it lays the foundation for the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the coming to power of the Communist Party. And not to mention, with regard to Africa, how pre-1917 Russia thwarted the pretensions of Western European nations, such as the Italian colonialists, who in the 1890s tried to overthrow the independent African nation that is Ethiopia, but was unsuccessful because they were armed to the teeth by Russia. And so all of this history is oftentimes well known to many Africans. It may come as a shocking surprise to many of our African-American friends, but that's another story for another day, perhaps. But it also sheds light on why at some of these votes in the United Nations with regard to sanctioning Russia, votes in the General Assembly, or ousting Russia from the Human Rights Commission, a number of African nations abstained. And then you had Ethiopia, of course, which went further and voted against. And even the New York Times acknowledged that this long-term history between Russia and Ethiopia, which I just made reference to, with Russia helping to preserve Ethiopian sovereignty, even before the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, that has a lot to do with their present relationship. And so I'm afraid to say that many of our Black American friends, they can hum along as much as they want with the imperialist hymn book straight out of Washington, but all it will serve to do is alienate many Africans who we will need, I'm afraid to say, if the United States, as seems to be the case, lurches even further to the right.
So in a nutshell, and I'm sorry to ask you to kind of reiterate, but I want to put it in this context. A lot of people who listen to my show, they say, Wilmer, you're always talking about Russia. Wilmer, why are you down with Putin? Wilmer, he's crazy. Wilmer, he's evil. He's a dictator. He's a what's the A word that Biden likes to use? Authoritarian, and all, So to those in the community, to those in this audience that take issue with my merely trying to explain the history and the reality, what do you say to them in terms of why a clearer understanding of Russia and of China is invaluable to our future as African Americans?
Well, I was just equating Anthony Blinken with the lawyer who talks out of both sides of his mouth. My client didn't do it and he won't do it again. Well, that must be a national tick, because Black Americans do the same thing. On the one hand, they'll talk about Malcolm X, say, take it to the United Nations. Okay, fair enough. So when you go to the United Nations, who are you going to talk to? I mean, are you going to talk to London? You're going to talk to Paris? You're going to talk to Berlin? I mean, who are you going to ally with? Obviously, you're going to have to ally with those who have a bone to pick with Uncle Sam. And if you talk about allying with the Cubans, which I would highly recommend, and they see you trashing the nations that are keeping that island afloat, speaking of China and Russia, well, they're going to look askance at you. Now, I know that these Black Americans have a dilemma. That is to say, they don't want, it's part of our culture to sell wolf tickets, to even as we're retreating, moonwalking to seem like we're advancing. And so we don't want to admit that we saw what happened to Paul Robeson when he was internationalist, when he learned how to speak Russian, etc. His income fell from the 6 figures to the low 4 figures. His passport was taken. They tried to kill him. And so you don't want to admit that you don't want that fate to befall you. So instead, it's the usual tick of the United States. If the US has an antagonist, speaking of Russia, China, then you have to adopt the same antagonist, although of course, oftentimes you'll adopt a different rationale. You say they're racist, for example. So even during the time when the United States and China were in bed together during the 70s and the 80s, well, you'll find that many Black Americans were not complaining about China. But now that China is considered to be the bad guy du jour, of course, they talk more trash talk to China than Joseph R. Biden. And so people need to reconcile these contradictions, either that or find a good psychoanalyst.
Putin said at the 10th Moscow Conference on International Security, he said, Western countries are desperately clinging to their vanishing hegemony, but the unipolar world order is becoming a thing of the past. Folks, you need to read. You need to stop listening to the chatter from MSNBC and CNN, and you need to start reading some of what these people are saying and then comparing what you read to what you see going on. And you'll start to get those shadows on the wall will start to fade away as you sit in the cave and look at the wall. Something happened. There was a story today I found very, very interesting. And while we got a couple minutes, I'd love to get your take on this. There was a story that's saying that that Russia is reaching out to North Korea, and that there could very quickly be a formal establishment of relations between China, North Korea, and Putin and Russia. My question to you is, if that develops as it is projected that it will, what does that do for the United States in that region, being South Korea and Japan?
Well, it's back to the future. Recall that post June 26, 1950, there was this event that we refer to on this side of the Pacific as the Korean War. Actually, it was much more profound than that. And at that particular moment, you had North Korea, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, yoked together with the then Soviet Union and China, facing the United States and its allies. And the United States needs to tread very carefully if that alliance is revived and resuscitated. In that context, note that during her controversial trip to Asia, Speaker Nancy Pelosi, of course, visited Taiwan. Less publicized was the fact that she visited South Korea. And even though the president recently elected was in Seoul, the capital, he only talked to her on the telephone. He wouldn't come face to face to meet with her. And I think it's because China is South Korea's leading trade partner, that South Korea is facing a nation across the border, speaking of North Korea, with which it has very, shall we say, complicated and complex relations. And at the same time, this recent tidbit about the DPRK, North Korea and Russia, only adds to the complexity of South Korea. Indeed, let me now engage in some speculation to move away from the realm of fact and history. Do not be surprised, particularly in light of what I've just said about Turkey, that South Korea and perhaps even Japan will begin to move away from the United States in this multipolar world and move closer to China, which is, of course, the giant of the neighborhood, which is soon to be the leading economy. And as everybody knows, even the United States is dependent upon China. I mean, the People's Bank of China is owed about $1 trillion by the United States. It used to be $2 trillion, but they've been cutting their purchases of US Treasury bills, which go to fund everything from the Pentagon to the post office because of the downturn in relations. And so it's Washington is pursuing this harebrained policy of seeking to intimidate its major funder, speaking of China, and at the same time expecting these nations like Japan and South Korea to go along with it. It seems to me sooner rather than later, they're going to cut their losses. And that truly will be a Copernican shift in the global correlation of forces.
What about the development of military cooperation and collaboration in terms of China and Russia joining forces in war games? I think for the second time this year, and for the third time in the last 2 years, they're now again engaged in collaboration and war games. And I bring that up again to point out, folks, the unipolar game is over and the multipolar game is on. And unfortunately, the United States seems to be stuck on trying to play the new game by the old rules. And the rest of the world isn't going for it. Dr. Horne.
Well, I think what's happening is what often happens, which is that oftentimes people are comforted by the fiction that the status quo is eternal. Because if the status quo is eternal, that means you don't have to keep up with changing events. In fact, that means ipso facto that events don't change.
Right.
And therefore you don't have to study. You can sleep comfortably.
Or when the events do change, it still doesn't impact your reality.
Until it does, of course.
Right.
And so I understand that sentiment. I understand why it's rampant in the United States of America, because, you know, about 80 odd years ago, Henry Luce, the founder of what was then the Time Life magazine empire, pronounced and enunciated this concept of the so-called American century. And I think that many took Luce too literally. Many of them actually embroidered upon his excess by assuming that he meant so-called American eternity. But whether you were talking about the decade of 1940 to 1950, when the United States was able to subdue, of course, with the assistance of the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, whatever the case, those days are rapidly receding into history and are in the rearview mirror.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate that analysis, and I stress analysis. And as always, look forward to having you back. Folks, Dr. Wilmer Leon here, Inside the Issues is where you are, Sirius XM.